primary control with critical vehicle function.
Welcome to Future Thinking, episode 118. My name is Alexander Schatten. This is a very special episode for me, as my guest is an eminent researcher, and not only with impressive credentials on paper as we see it so often today. He had and has major impacts in our understanding of medical research, or research quality in general, public health, and how to handle critical situations under limited knowledge. His work was and is highly influential and extraordinarily important for our understanding where medical science, but really science in general, is standing, how we dealt with the COVID crisis, and how we could get our act together again. He's professor of medicine at Stanford, expert in epidemiology, population health, and biomedical data science. I'm speaking, of course, of Professor John Ioannidis. I mentioned John in several past episodes, and I'm happy to have him on the show in person now. Allow me a few words about this podcast before we start. Most episodes of this podcast are in German, but a growing number is in English. You can filter for language on the podcast website. This podcast is also free and contains no ads. If you like it, just do me one favor. Subscribe to the feed, send a like or 5 stars or whatever the virtual currency might be, and recommend this episode to friends, colleagues, and on social media. Now, back to our episode. John writes in his bio, "Science is the best thing that can happen to humans, but doing research is like swimming in an ocean at night. But how can we make progress under these circumstances?" Without further ado, let's ask Professor John Ioannidis. John, thank you so much for taking time for a conversation.
Thank you for inviting me, Alexander.
It's really a pity. I really hope to see you in person, but then we had schedules that were totally non-overlapping. But anyways, you made it possible virtually, so I'm very thankful for that.
I'm sure that we will meet one day also in person.
Yeah, that would be great. Because I know you via your papers since many years, and probably the first that I came across was, I think, a very, very influential paper, which was called "Why Most Research is Wrong." I think this was from 2005. So actually 20 years ago. And maybe it would be a good start to, maybe you could give us an idea what this paper was about, but also what was your motivation and your interest to get into that type of research, or meta-research, if you will.
So that paper was indeed published in 2005, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, in PLOS Medicine. And it was one effort to try to put together some possibilities of calculating what are the chances that once we think we have come up with a scientific discovery with some statistical inference suggesting that we have a statistically significant result, how likely is that not to be so? It builds on empirical evidence that had accumulated in the past, actually over several decades, not just by myself, but also by many other scientists in different fields. And it is trying to model this post-study probability of such a significant finding actually not being genuine, but being a false positive, kind of a false signal that is misleading. It tries to take into account factors like how small or large the studies are, what is their power to detect different signals and effects, how much bias there is, how many teams are struggling to find new discoveries, and perhaps they're competing, trying to outpace each other, and also the environment of biases that may be surrounding the efforts to make these discoveries. It was not something that arose out of nowhere. There was a lot of work on methods, on biases, on empirical assessments of different types of study designs in medicine, but also in other fields. I think that many of us had struggled with the almost ubiquitous presence of biases and false claims and results that were exaggerated and later not replicated. Building on something that is not true, of course, is a waste, because not only the original observation, but also the subsequent work that tries to build on that is built on thin air. So it was not something that didn't have some past history to support it. And of course, it's something that led to more work after that. In the last 20 years, a lot of things has changed, and some for the better and some for the worse.
Yeah, maybe we can come to what happened over the last 20 years, but I think the results that you came up in this paper were, let's say, not very positive. You also wrote another paper, incidentally, in 2018, if I have this correctly here. The scientists who publish a paper every 5 days. I would like to come to that back a bit later, because when I talk with people in science, but also like general audience, if you will, about quality issues in science, or the case that the results of studies don't hold, then I often have the feeling that there is sort of a misunderstanding in a way. And I would like to tell you how I try to explain it. For me personally, there are two types of failures. Maybe you can find better words for it. One I would call it an honest failure, and the other one is a dishonest failure. So an honest failure would be something like, I have a very concrete idea, let's say, for instance, that a particular pharmaceutical substance is helping as a treatment, something like that. And then I'm doing a good study design, then I'm doing a well done study, then I'm doing a proper statistical research, and then eventually turns out it was not so, like the substance didn't perform as intended, or has side effects that we don't want to accept, something like that. So that would be what I would call like an honest failure, if you will. That's what science, it just didn't work out. That's not the problem, and most people think it's that. But what I think is much more often the case, there's also an interesting Lancet article from Klein and Horton in Lancet 2014. They analyzed that too, that you either start with a very bad study design, or bad data acquisition, or bad statistics, or all of that. And that's what I would call sort of dishonest research. So actual research that could never have led to good results. And our literature seems to be filled with that. Does this make sense? This is discerning.
So there's indeed very different types of failure. The first example that you mentioned, where a study is conceived, designed, executed, analyzed, and reported very rigorously and with good intention and with good methods, I would not call it a failure because it found non-significant results. I would call it a success because yes, it showed that the drug is not effective, but that is a very informative result. It can tell us if it is so conclusive and so strong in terms of the evidence and excludes the possibility that there is a substantial benefit. This means that we're saving tons of effort and time and resources and money that would be wasted otherwise if we were to pursue that. And we're not exposing patients, to something that would be toxic or not effective, or both toxic and not effective. So I would call that a great success story, not a failure. Now, there's many real failures, and these would be in a continuum from complete fraud all the way to entirely honest error. And I want to start from the spectrum of honest error. Science is very difficult to do. We all struggle under uncertain circumstances, so we cannot have control on everything that we try to measure and on all the tools and technologies and software and iterations that we have to go through. So honest error is very likely to happen. There's nothing wrong with that ethically. Of course, we try to do our best, but errors do happen. I think the problem is when we do not recognize these errors. If we recognize these errors, I would say, in a way, it is a success because we recognize that this is a way that error can creep in, and maybe we can prevent it affecting future studies. So it may have a benefit in the long term, that detection of error and correcting it or finding ways to prevent it in the future. There's other errors that are very difficult to detect and are never detected, and especially in a non-transparent environment where data sets are not shared, the codes are not shared, we cannot really see the machinery of the work behind the scientific product. They're very difficult to detect and maybe just remain there, and then they propagate whatever has come out of that erroneous effort. But they might still be honest, not deliberate or intention to cheat or to fool other scientists and the public. Then we have questionable research practices, which is a term that has been introduced for a number of years now. Some people prefer the term detrimental research practices. Some people call them outright unethical research practices. What are these? They're situations where the methods and our approach to conducting a study and analyzing data and reporting is not really optimal, and there's some data dredging. There's some effort to get the best looking results. There's a little bit of cheating, perhaps, and cutting corners to try to get to a desirable narrative or a desirable conclusion. People chasing statistical significance at all costs. How? Perhaps by reanalyzing their data set in many possible ways until they hit a p-value that they like, or throwing out some outliers and perhaps coming up with a justification on why these outliers were thrown out. That may sound not that unreasonable, but in a way, there is a directive of what type of result I want to get, and I start cutting corners and torturing the data and the analysis to try to get it. So this is a gray zone. I think if there is transparency about what was done, and if the cheating component is avoided, I can see that it may be fine to say, well, I decided to throw these 4 outliers from the data set, and this is the explanation. And you're open to criticism for what you did, but people can see why this happened and where it happened and how it affects the results. And in many situations, it may have been a wrong move, but at least it is transparent and people can be aware of that happening. Then you have situations where the combination of lack of transparency and cheating makes for a very explosive mix. And I think we have a lot of that. And then you get results that may seem to be nice, but actually they reflect just the impact of that lack of transparency plus cheating. Then at the end of the spectrum, you have fraud that is classic misconduct, like falsification, fabrication, plagiarism. People create data sets that do not exist, and they claim that this is real information, and actually it's just fake. They distort data in ways that are entirely inappropriate and just build some results that should not be there, or they just plagiarize. And we have many new ways of doing this type of fraudulent or fake work nowadays. We used to say that fraud maybe accounts for about 1%, this type of classic fraud in the scientific literature. And I have stated that many times in the past. Perhaps an estimate for what is going on now is that it accounts for about 10%, not just 1%, because we have new ways of massive...
outright fraud.
Yes. Why do I say 10%? Because we have ways to create massive fraudulent papers, fake papers. For example, we have paper mills that are practically companies that are producing fake papers for people to put their names on and build CVs and get citations and get whatever reward. And in the past, creating a fake paper was an art. It took time, effort, commitment. I felt pity for many of these fraudulent people because with that same effort, they could have done some really good science instead. Now people can really create hundreds, thousands, millions, in theory, millions of papers overnight, and they would be entirely fake. And we know that about 1 out of 7 submissions to journals are apparently paper mill products. They're fake papers generated by artificial intelligence increasingly. So if we have 7 million papers published every year, which is the current estimate, we have a huge problem of entirely fake papers. That is a new challenge in a sense. We didn't have this massive outright fraud in the past that we have now.
But all the gray area in between comes on top of that. Maybe just one number. I remember there was a study 1 or 2 years ago, a Dutch study, and I remember a second study. I don't exactly know where it came from, but I remember one was Dutch, where they asked scientists if they used, let's say, unethical practices in the last year. And it was made in a way that was anonymized, something like that.
Yeah,
and I think the result was like more than 50% said yes to that. So, I mean, that's like outright shocking, no?
It is shocking, but it's probably not something unexpected. This has been seen in several surveys. And of course, these are sensitive questions. So it's not easy to say that, I have been using unethical practices in my research. And of course, the people who run these surveys, they try to make them such that they will give you more reliable results. But still, I think that there's underreporting. They often ask whether people in their immediate environment are using this type of fraudulent or unethical or questionable practices. And then their responses are much higher in terms of positivity compared to am I using versus are other people in my immediate vicinity using such practices. So we have to start from a point of baseline where most scientists probably have engaged in some questionable research practices at times. It could be subconscious or unconscious at times. People are very strongly attracted by the work that they do. They have very strong beliefs, very strong priors. They see patterns, they see narratives, they see signals where they do not exist actually. And they may have allegiance bias and confirmation bias to come up with a particular type of result that they find most attractive. Good scientists persevere to try to get to their goal. So how much of the perseverance is healthy commitment and effort of an honest scientist who just tries again and again and again versus data dredging versus questionable research practices sometimes is not so easy to decipher. But even well-intentioned scientists will fall into the trap of just being fooled by their own selves in a way. It's a very strong attraction to try to convince yourself that you're right. and very difficult to convince yourself that you're wrong.
Yeah. No, that's certainly true. However, I would like to pivot more to the more extreme cases, because what I find also very shocking here is that you would actually expect that the publication system is much more critical in that sense, because I refer to one paper that he wrote in 2018, the scientists who publish a paper every 5 days. Now, I mean, everyone who is just thinking a little bit for himself will realize that no one can come up with some original scientific finding every 5 days. I mean, you might work for a time and then you might write a few papers, but not like for an extended period of time. So that's quite obvious when that happens. Now, there was one case, I don't know if you know the case from Jan Hendrik Schön from 2001.
Yes.
Because it, just maybe for the audience who doesn't know it, he was a German physicist, because it reminded me to your paper. He published on average every 8 days a scientific publication. And what's even more shocking now is not in some irrelevant journals. He published between 2000 and 2001 more than 15 articles in Science and Nature, more than 15 articles in Science for people who are not directly in science. This is like the high, how should you say, like every scientist wants to have one publication in Science or Nature. He has 15 in 2 years. And on top of that, more than 10 in Physical Review and Applied Physical Letters, which are also high class journals. Now, my point is, no one questions that someone publishes 15 articles in Science and Nature in 2 years. And now you wrote 2018, like 18 years later, we have similarly not learned from that practice, did we?
This is a very complex environment, and things have changed dramatically since the times of Hendrik Schön. He was an artist in his fraud. As I said, now we have taken these problems to a completely different scale, to a massive scale, and I think that his productivity would be outpaced by probably 500,000 scientists. I quoting this with a little bit of uncertainty, but it is very common nowadays for scientists to publish a very large number of papers. This doesn't mean that they're fraudulent. I think that we have to be very careful here, because science over time has evolved to become more collaborative, more teamwork. Some fields are only making progress roughly by teamwork. So, for example, empirical experimental physics, high energy particle physics, people publish papers where there's sometimes thousands, 5,000 authors on the same paper. Basically, if they're part of the CERN experiment that is being presented, they will have their names on. And of course, it is not that thousands of people wrote that paper, but yes, in a way, they have participated in that experiment and they have participated in the organization. So they have some share in it. And this is becoming very common in many areas, in biomedicine as well. Genetics, for example, has done that for a number of years with studies that have hundreds and sometimes even more than 1,000 co-authors who join forces into some overarching project, and that project may generate lots of papers, and then they will have a lot of papers. If you look at those who are the most productive, I think that they're a mixed phenotype. There are some who are indeed very productive and perhaps very well connected. They participate especially in some prolific projects that are doing mostly, let's say, incremental work much of the time, but it could be good quality work. It doesn't have to be poor quality. It could be that they just add some new blocks of information on a given topic, doing normal science, not paradigm shifting, but adding to our information base. And then there's another group that is the fraudulent ones, who are really just gaming the system, contributing massive papers that either they have not contributed at all. So, perhaps they just buy authorship for these papers, or they are gift authors. This is, for example, very common with some departments where powerful department chairs would have their name placed on everything that comes out of their department, even though they may have contributed nothing to it. And in some cases, it could be outright fraud. So papers that are massively produced from some centers that have no tradition in doing this type of research and no expertise and very little in terms of resources. And suddenly, from the middle of nowhere, from some hospital in Egypt, for example, you see that they can publish more clinical trials than any center around the world on a given topic. And then, then you start to wonder what is going on here. Are these real patients? Is that real research? Is it real trials that we're talking about? So it's a mixed bag, some of the best and most prolific, along with some of the worst and most fraudulent. When it comes to Nature and Science, I think these top journals, yes, it is very difficult to publish even a single paper. And I think for many scientists, publishing a single paper in Science or Nature is a hallmark of their worth and landmark achievement for their careers. But nowadays, we have a new problem. We have some people who have published not 10 or 15, but many hundreds of papers in Nature and Science. We have some who have published more than 500 or 700. And who are they? They're editors, staff writers, and science journalists, can publish mostly short pieces, but sometimes long features that may be longer than the original articles, practically with no peer review. The editor says, I want a piece on this topic tonight, and you get it by the end of the day and it's published next morning. They can be pretty influential because they're in Nature and Science. They cover cutting edge topics that are very hot, that perhaps there is very little in terms of solid scientific literature, but the editor of these journals wants to cover that topic early on and kind of shape the environment. And then it's the first piece that is published on that theme. It gets very highly cited. It gets disseminated. People say this is in Nature and Science. Some of the top medical journals do the same. Lancet, BMJ, for example, do the same. They have big magazine sections. That creates another challenge because you have people who are not experts by any means in the field kind of shape the science and the nature of frontiers that are completely vague much of the time and uncertain and in very early fermentation. They kind of set the rules. They set the calibration of what we know. For example, during the pandemic, this happened repeatedly. Before we knew anything, Nature and Science and BMJ and Lancet will come out with their massive pieces. With, the Lancet editor has published more than 2,000 pieces in his journal. They know everything before we know anything.
It's amazing. I would like to come back to the COVID story a bit later, because that is a very important topic in its own right. I just like to wrap this up a little bit. My gut feeling is that the situation is all but happy, because it's not only like in pharmaceutical research. We have similar situation in, for instance, in 2023 was a Nature paper that analyzed bias in ecological research. You have similar things in bias in climate research. You have like Brian Nosek had 2015, the replication crisis in psychology. We have it practically in every area of science, that we are standing on shaky ground. I was just looking before, couldn't find it though. There are economists, I'm going to reference this in the show notes. I think Stanford economists who made an analysis about output versus input, if you will. And if I just wrap it into a very short sentence, was like the output is rising exponentially in all metrics. So like the number of scientists, the number of papers, what have you, amount, money spent and so on. But the output actually decreases exponentially in this inverse way, if you will. So it's like shocking in a way that it seems like we are standing still, and only standing still because we're constantly increasing the effort that we put into it. That was at least the lesson I drew from that. And that's not great. And number one, do you agree with this rough statement, or is this too simplistic?
I think that I would be a bit less pessimistic in that, yes, we do have a proliferation of numbers in terms of numbers of papers that we publish, numbers of authors, numbers of scientists. So yes, this is indeed true. Now, whether we have a sharp decrease in the output, this is a bit difficult to judge. Because we have to define what is really the output that we are interested in. Are we looking on some surrogate endpoint? Because, for example, a number of papers could be an output. Many funding agencies would be happy just to see more papers being published. But of course, I think most of us would not be happy just with that.
Yeah, exactly.
In medicine, we would want to see life extended, or better quality of life, better outcomes in various diseases. And we have to acknowledge that medicine does make progress. Public health does make progress. Most sciences do make progress to some extent. But it is true that the progress is not proportional to the massive increase in some of the other numbers, the more surrogate outcomes. It is more incremental, and a lot of avenues are dead ends. A lot of others contribute very little in terms of the resources that we have placed into their pursuit. It's not that we go backwards, science moves forward. But if you think about how many smart people are putting so much effort over so many years, one would have hoped to have some better efficiency. So I think that the great challenge is how to improve our efficiency, and also maybe find some ways to improve our track record of innovation, of disruption. There are some empirical studies that suggest that disruption has decreased over time, that we do science that is less disruptive, or we do very few studies that are really disruptive. We do lots of very little contributions, incremental stuff that they are okay if they're true and unbiased, but that's not really what people would like to see.
Yeah, that was also another Nature paper that had the same outcome, that disruptive results are going back. But because you said this efficiency, I have the feeling that we are suffocating in bureaucracy and other things that are not really helping science. And I would like to give you a quotation of, I don't know if you heard of Max Perutz. Max Perutz was a Nobel laureate, Austrian, in fact, but he had to flee Austria because of the Nazi dictatorship. And then he went to England, to Cambridge. And he was Nobel laureate, and I think he worked on hemoglobin, if I'm not entirely wrong. Anyway, great. Okay, excellent. But the point I wanted to make is he was asked in an interview, this must have been in the 60s or 70s, in a radio interview, about his success, or why he was successful. Because not only he was successful, what's absolutely stunning is his lab in Cambridge had 9 Nobel laureates. So from his lab and from his PhD people and so on. So he had 9 Nobel laureates in his lab. And his answer was, he has some simple guidelines. No politics, no committees, no reports, no referees, no interviews, just gifted, highly motivated people picked by a few men of good judgment. If you would like to implement this today, I think you would be fired on the next day from university, no? What is...
Yeah, no, I think that we have made our life very difficult. And I think that the recipe that he describes sounds like a very successful recipe. Of course, there may be some recall bias. He was an amazing scientist. The team that he built and he worked in was the best of the best. So, but it is true that we have lots of restrictions and lots of limitations and lots of outside influences that are often bureaucratic or political, committees and reports, as you mentioned, it can waste an enormous amount of time that are not really very helpful. There is a problem because in trying to fix many of the problems that we face, one reaction has been to propose things that fall into these things that Max Perutz would have disavowed as being
Exactly.
instrumental. We want to seek more accountability, for example, and that means that we try to push for some science reform that will make research more transparent and more reproducible and more accountable. But we need to remember that why are we doing this? We're doing this so that research can become better, it can become more efficient, we can do more with less, rather than just have some science police that is asking for more documents and for more documentation and for more signatures to be obtained, or more checklists just for the sake of checklists, and more bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy. So there is a risk that even the best intentioned scientists who really want to improve research, we have to be very, very careful about how are we trying to do this? Are we really promoting the best research, or are we just adding extra layers to make life even more difficult in order to satisfy our wish to say, okay, we did something. We had a problem and we did something. Sometimes doing something may be worse than doing nothing. You just add another problem to someone who already has lots of problems.
It's what the late anthropologist David Graeber called the box ticking efforts, right? So you claim you made your job by making another checklist and another form and whatnot, but if this really achieves what you intended to achieve, is then secondary.
Yeah, and I've seen that repeatedly. I do worry that even some of my ideas may have promoted some of that. So I'm trying to be careful about what we try to do to fix the problems, because they can make things worse sometimes.
I would like to pivot now to the effects because one thing you could say, okay, science, and there's problem in the quality of science, so science will figure that out. So you could have this point of view, but the reality is that so many topics in our modern world, from climate change to energy politics to COVID or to pharmaceutical products, is strongly linked with what science is doing. And if the one part isn't doing a good job, then we have, of course, in the follow-up, a lot of additional problems. You, for instance, wrote about a lot of the nutritional recommendations that we see all the time in all sorts of media. I don't know if you know Vinay Prashad, the American doctor who is always a bit like outspoken and essentially says when you read something about nutrition, it's most likely wrong. Then we had this stuff like Theranos. We had these big scandals where a lot of was promised but then didn't hold. And then, of course, we had the whole COVID situation. Do you want to maybe just say one word to the whole nutrition thing, because it's maybe a topic that's interesting for many people?
Nutrition is important, and everybody cares about what they eat to some extent. So it affects everyone. It's not like a specialty disease that might affect only a subsegment of the population. So this makes it a very popular theme. It is very widely discussed in media and social media and everyday conversations. At the same time, it is a very popular theme for scientific investigation. There's probably a few million papers on nutrition and related sciences. We know for a long time the limitations of the most popular types of studies that can be done, which are mostly observational, epidemiological studies, trying to find associations and signals, which are correlations that very rarely would reflect some causal effect, let alone something that could be modified and obtain some real benefit in health outcomes. So we have a literature that has grown entirely unchecked and is growing bigger and bigger, and it doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. There are some exceptions. I'm not going to say that all nutritional science should be dismissed. There's some valuable information that we have obtained with randomized trials, clinical nutrition, people with nutritional deficiencies, how to manage people with nutrition problems in the ICU. There are clearly winners in nutritional science, and some really very strong scientists and methodologies have worked at times in nutrition. But there's this mass of hundreds of thousands, probably more than a million papers that are just stuck in this sort of plain correlation, association, struggling with confounding and struggling with measurement error.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to measure accurately what someone ate, let alone to do that longitudinally and get a composite picture. It's very difficult to account for individual variability, for individual differences in personalized responses to different nutrients and different combinations of nutrients and foods. So it's a very messy field that somehow, because everybody is interested in, there's lots of powerful committees and guideline panels that try to make recommendations. And most of these recommendations are built on thin air. They have no solid science behind them. So basically they reflect largely the allegiance biases of people who craft them. On one hand, you may have big food that is trying to promote its own products and its own priorities. On the other hand, you may have big allegiance bias of people who are, let's say, well-intentioned. They want to save the world, but they may propose things that have absolutely no rigorous science to support and create even more confusion by what they propose. I'm not sure which one is worse.
Yeah.
I think that both are creating an explosive mix of very poor science feeding into recommendations and also into media and policy making.
And of course, also, I think it hurts science in a general term very strongly, because the audience just has the impression every other year you get a different recommendation, and often completely opposing recommendations. And then at one point in time, you think, okay, so what the heck? I mean, they clearly don't know what they're talking about, because how can it be that 2 years ago you were supposed to do that, and 2 years later you're supposed to do the next thing? I mean, this clearly doesn't reflect well back to the scientific process.
I think this is true. Of course, science may change over time, and I think that we should be honest that our evidence base has evolved, and it's not the same now. And we can document that, and we can explain why this happened. But as you say, if our evidence base changes so frequently and kind of disjointly with what our recommendations are, then I think that we have a problem. We have a problem of our credibility, and people start thinking that this is not very serious, and I shouldn't put much trust on what these people say.
Now I would like to come to maybe the topic that interests me the most, and that is, I always call it like decision making under uncertainty. Like when you are in an organization or as a government or a society, and you are facing difficult situations, like COVID was such a situation, and where you have limited evidence, a limited, let's say, foundation data of high quality and so on. So then you essentially have to make decisions under limited evidence. I think this is a very interesting, very complicated or complex problem, actually. And there was let's say, a conflict between Nassim Taleb and you. It must have been in March 2020 or something around that time. And I mean, I like Nassim Taleb's book a lot, but I have to say he sometimes, how should I say, uses language and the discussion style that, well, I would hope he wouldn't use this type of rhetoric. Anyway, the point was, and I followed it very closely at that time, and my gut feeling was, because you wrote an article and he criticized your article, and at that point in time I had the feeling that he had a point, because his point was, we don't know a lot, we cannot do evidence-based measures when you don't know a lot. However, the main criticism that I have about the whole COVID debacle is that we did not work hard enough to build up evidence properly after the first moment when we were sort of surprised. And now you wrote an article about this whole discussion with Taleb last year, and I would be very interested how you see this whole argument, this whole evidence-based versus decision-making in retrospect.
I had a very interesting debate with Nassim Taleb, and our debate was actually published in the International Journal of Forecasting, presenting his views and my views to juxtapose. And I think that we have to acknowledge that when you have tremendous uncertainty, very limited or no evidence, or perhaps even misleading evidence in some early phases of a new phenomenon, one has to be very careful. And I think that nobody would disagree that you want to take into account the worst possible scenarios when you know very little, and try to respond to the possibility of the worst possible scenario. At the same time, though, trying to have some estimate of what your response might mean in terms of damage or harms or things that might happen that might cause a problem. And perhaps the problem that you cause might be bigger than the problem that you're trying to face and avoid. You need to try to be ready to adjust your response to the accumulation of new evidence, and hopefully put a lot of effort to try to get evidence that is reliable as quickly as possible. So it is very interesting, but somehow I had been presented as the person who said absolutely no to lockdown and social distancing, and mocking people who said that we should do that. This has absolutely nothing to do with reality. In fact, I gave interviews where I said, that's fine. We don't know what we're facing with. It is okay to start with some very aggressive measures, but what we need is reliable evidence to be obtained as quickly as possible. And then we will see, maybe we need to go even more stringent, or perhaps we can do something different and have better outcomes once we account for all the different outcomes that can happen, especially when you're dealing not with a circumscribed experiment, but you're dealing with an entire society, with our whole world, with our health, our education, our economy, our, health in all its dimensions, mental health, physical health, our health systems, prospects in the future, our prevention machinery, our therapeutic tools, and everything is up in the air. So you cannot just say that I just want to decrease the number of detected infections.
Also, economy and all other educational things are all parameters you have to take into consideration, because even if everyone is healthy a year later, but if the economy is completely destroyed and children haven't learned anything, then this might have long-term effects that are worse than the short-term gains, no?
Exactly. So I think that many people were just focused on measuring detected infections, which were a small fragment of the total infections, especially in early times. The number of undetected infections was much, much larger than those detected. So even that was not a measure that we could have very good guidance based upon. And very little or no attention to all these other dimensions that, unfortunately, I think we did major errors and led to an overwhelming catastrophe. It's our own creation to a large extent. I think that saying that, well, we had a pandemic. Yes, we had a pandemic, but the way that we reacted would make things much, much worse in so many dimensions of health and many other aspects beyond health, like education and the overall stability of our society.
Yeah, that reminds me, the British historian Neil Ferguson wrote this in his book Doom. Crisis is only the one part of such a situation. The other thing is how society is prepared and how it is reacting. And only the two together give you the whole picture, right? And when you react badly or poorly, then you can create a lot of effects that are not, in some not desirable. I mean, the thing that I'm really struggling with is on the one hand, Taleb is certainly is always focusing on these. I mean, he's right. When you're dead, right? So when you're dead, it's not important what you could have done tomorrow, right? It's nice what you could have done tomorrow, but you're dead now. So that also, like in economics, when you bankrupt, you're bankrupt. So you could have made a big gain next week, but you cannot because you're bankrupt. So I get this. On the other hand, I think, and I have the feeling that we as a society tend to do this in the last years, is you can search for the last minuscule high risk situation. Like I could go out of the house now and someone could throw something from the window and kill me. So you can come up with all sorts of real big problems. But if you only focus on that, you might not move at all anymore, right?
I think that this did happen to a large extent. I think that the response in most settings in most countries was paranoid. I don't think that it had any notion of evidence-based features. It was not based on science. Of course, many papers were published. About 800,000 papers were published eventually on COVID-19 since the beginning of the pandemic until now. But largely the response in most countries and most settings was dictated by very early perspectives and narratives and opinions. I mentioned before the hundreds of editorials and opinion pieces and features written in leading journals by people who had no clue about what they were talking about. And I'm not saying that to blame them. They had no expertise, no training in epidemiology or, any related field. On top of that, you had influencers who were very powerful in media and social media, legacy media, completely crazy in what narratives they endorsed. And I think it was a complete disaster. It's very sad. It was a very serious problem. We did have a pandemic that could kill a lot of people, but we managed to kill far more by doing what we did. And I feel personally responsible for that, even though I tried to oppose many of these paranoid approaches. The fact that I was not convincing, I blame myself. I feel that, I don't know, maybe I should have done something more. I should have been more convincing.
But for me, the shocking situation is that, I 100% agree with you. My observation is exactly the same. But for me, shocking is we could say, okay, COVID was like the outlier, if you will, and we did things wrong here, but that's not my observation. I have the feeling that with nearly all big topics that we have, be it economic troubles or be it the reaction to climate change or what have you, is driven from outright hysteria that is more often than not leading to measures that actually make the situation worse than better. So it's not like, okay, we made a mistake here and we don't do the mistakes. No, I have the feeling we make the mistakes everywhere around. And that's for me a shocking observation.
I think you're right. We do make a lot of mistakes in policy and in the translation of science into policy. I think what was different in COVID was the acuteness of the situation. So, mistakes happened massively within a short period of time. And it was very visible because everybody was affected visibly, in their everyday life and in their everyday experience. While other mistakes in policy and in the ability to absorb and translate and implement science are happening in a more chronic way. So we are facing major problems worldwide, and probably we're doing very little for them, or we're doing things that are not very effective. It's not that we have always perfect science to guide us, but probably we have some science. It's not as acute and abrupt and uncertain as when a new pandemic breaks. We have chronic problems that we should have reached a point of being able to deal them more calmly in a more evidence-based way and with less toxicity and toxic debate within our communities.
That is exactly the point I would like to end, or maybe end our conversation with, because that's something that terrifies me. You had the conversation with Daphne Ruby from OIF, and I know Daphne, and so this was how she was kind enough to connect us. And in the conversation with Daphne, you brought the quotation like, what we know is often like swimming in the night in the dark ocean. So like we often know much less than we would like to know. By the way, this reminded me, Karl Popper, the Austrian philosopher, I remember a TV interview from the 80s or so where he said something very similar. His quotation was, it's like you go into a coal cellar dressed in a black suit without a light and try to... So it's a very, very similar metaphor actually, right? But I think what shocked me were two things. Number one, the lack of, maybe the right word is humility in what we know and what we don't know, and express it in the way what we know to what we don't know. And the second thing is, my gut feeling is, if we are in such a situation, we need good exchange, we need discussion of ideas. And my feeling was it was more like a partisan war. I mean, also like you were attacked in ways I said, what the heck is wrong with you? I mean, okay, you don't agree with John Ioannidis, fine, then bring an argument or something. How the heck are you talking? I mean, and other people as well. Think of Bhattacharya in the US and so on. You might not agree with him or not, but I mean, he's a respectable scientist and he makes a point and there's a listen and then argue. But did we lose our mind at that level? And do you have a hope that this gets better?
I think the toxicity did not help. And, both myself and many other scientists were attacked over the last several years. I feel that if I had a way to protect someone, I would protect those who disagreed with me, because, I think that they were also they were also attacked. And I think if we could find some approach where we respect people who disagree with us, where we say, okay, if I have 5 extra minutes of attention time, to whom would I want to give these 5 minutes? My preference would be to give them to those who disagree with me. Hearing my voice again is not going to help me much. I know what I think. I know what evidence I have. I know what I have arrived in terms of conclusions. I would like to hear people who disagree, who would criticize what I do, who would have a different perspective, perhaps different evidence, perhaps stronger evidence, perhaps better evidence, and perhaps I can learn from that. Or at least then I would be open to a dialogue and try to see in which points they're better, and I can improve my positions in which points they are perhaps they might think that they could improve their positions as well. I think very little of that happened. There was no willingness to see opponents as anything but enemies in a war, and enemies that had to be destroyed personally, reputationally, their lives even. I think that the death threats that I received, and practically all members of my family more or less were put at risk. It's very sad. And obviously you cannot have a very solid foundation for science to move into policy under these circumstances. It continues even now. I think it's very unfortunate. I received an email pretty recently from a journalist in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung with some very aggressive questions. It was clearly obvious that he wanted to write a hit piece. I responded to him. It is as if I had not responded. He wrote his hit piece no matter what, completely full of lies and completely irresponsible in what he did. I think he has his audience. He has his believers, in a sense, that probably would believe what he writes, no matter what he says has nothing to do with science, and it's just smearing. But this is the way that we're trying to function in science. And coming back to Max Perut's claim, no politics, no committees, no reports. I wish we could do that. And that's also my dream. But unfortunately, it is a situation that becomes more like a dream rather than reality, an unattainable dream in the middle of people who want to continue just throwing toxic material.
It's really terrible, and I can tell you, you're not the only one. I talked with other scientists and also entrepreneurs who don't even give interviews anymore to much of the legacy media, because they tell me, I realize you tell them something and then they write the hit piece so they exactly know already what they want to write, and then just maybe want to get a soundbite out of you that confirms their prejudice. And it's really bad. On the other hand, I think we have alternative channels now. And this is also an attempt, sort of maybe a small attempt nonetheless, to try to have a conversation that is a bit more civil, I hope, and can convey a bit more sensitive information. I want to be very respectful with your time. I would just like to ask you one last question, because I had Gerd Gigerenzer on my podcast recently. I don't know if you know him. He's a German.
I know him very well. He's a good friend.
Excellent. Great. Because I want to ask you, because he's always talking about heuristics versus complex models. And you had recently also a paper, Forecasting for COVID Has Failed. It's also, I think, from the last year or something like that. And maybe like as a final question, how is your approach towards this trend that we have in science and politics, to make hyper complex models that, in my opinion, often are simply not, they might be interesting from a scientific point of view, but are not really up to the task for the policy measures they are promoted for. Now I'm telling you my opinion, but what is your opinion also in reference to Professor Gigerenzer?
So I think that complexity is a feature that is very dominant in modern science. And to a large extent, after solving the simple problems, we are facing complex problems, and we need to respond with the appropriate methods to try to tackle them. This doesn't mean, though, that all our attempts at complex responses are successful. In fact, on average, they're likely to be less successful because of the complexity. And one has to be very careful not to overperform in terms of complexity in trying to model phenomena or try to collect evidence accounting for the complexity. because it can be very confusing, and it gives far more opportunities for errors and biases to creep in once you have a more complex approach compared to a more simple one. In some cases, some very simple tools, heuristics is one such example, may do amazingly well. And perhaps if you escalate complexity, you're just losing some of that beauty that you get in the simple approach, in what one of the fathers of epidemiology, Bradford Hill, would say: I would not believe something unless I can put it on the back of an envelope. Like a 2x2 table, you can put 4 numbers on the back of an envelope and you can calculate an odds ratio relative risk. Well, a very complex model, probably you would need terabytes of code to try to start to present what it is about. So we sometimes hide behind complexity. We throw some models or some analysis. They seem very sophisticated. They seem to be very scientific. But when you look at them, you realize that basically they offer no advantage compared to something that is more straightforward. And in fact, you wonder whether the originators of that work actually are trying to hide something. They're just trying to put themselves in the midst of a very complex environment where you cannot detect their errors. You cannot detect how exactly this happens. Why does it yield so weird results that are so incompatible with reality? Good luck. You have to spend weeks and months, if you can have access to the raw data and the code, which you don't most of the time anyhow, in order to start criticizing them. While otherwise it would have been very obvious that what they do is entirely wrong. I'm worried that complexity sometimes could be an alibi for confusion. This doesn't mean that we don't need to study complexity, but we need the right dose of complexity and the right placement in the scientific machinery.
John, thank you so much. I think this was a very brilliant end of our conversation. And I want to, first of all, thank you really very much to taking the time. It was really a pleasure and honor to talk with you. And also thank you really very much for the work that you did over the last 20 years. And I mean, the fact that you received death threats we are out of our minds, really. I mean, like, people cannot agree with you or whatever, fine. I mean, that's what we do, discuss, and we agree, disagree. But we really have to get our senses back and discuss in a civilized manner. Anyway, thank you very much for your work and for your time. It was a pleasure for me.
Thank you so much, Alexander. The pleasure was mine. Have a wonderful day.